When waiting became the strategy, it didn't start as hesitation. It started as discipline, a deliberate choice to pause, observe, and avoid unnecessary mistakes. But over time, that pause stopped being a tactic and became the strategy itself. To understand why this matters now, we need to return to a phase when uncertainty felt manageable. Markets were uneven but not hostile. Information was abundant, but rarely decisive. In that environment, waiting felt intelligent. Acting too early carried reputational risk. Acting too late carried none. Waiting began as prudence, then it spread. The first reveal begins with how decision-making changed inside institutions. Trades weren't rejected. They were delayed. Ideas weren't dismissed. They were monitored. Every opportunity came with a question. Do we need to act now, or can we wait for more clarity? Over time, clarity became the requirement, not the bonus. The second reveal appeared in performance behavior. Strategies designed for timing outperformed those designed for conviction. Flexibility was rewarded. Commitment was questioned. Waiting didn't just feel safer. It worked. And when waiting works, it becomes contagious. The third reveal came through language. Conversations shifted subtly. Let's see replaced let's act. We can always add later replace this is the moment. No one declared waiting as policy. It simply became the default response to uncertainty. This shift mattered because markets don't just price information, they price urgency. When urgency disappears, so does initiative. Capital stays present, but it stays undecided. Liquidity exists, but it doesn't lead. Support forms, but only after movement demands it. Waiting had stopped being a temporary choice. It had become the organizing principle. And when a market organizes itself around delay, every future test becomes heavier. Every move travels further. Every response arrives later than it should. At first, nothing seems wrong. Prices still move. Trades still clear. Calm still holds. But beneath that calm, the market is learning something dangerous. That acting first is optional. And once that lesson takes hold, the cost of waiting doesn't disappear. It compounds. What followed would show how a market built on delay behaves when waiting is no longer a choice, but a liability. As waiting solidified into habit, the market's tempo slowed in ways that felt almost comfortable. Moves unfolded more gradually. Reactions were measured. Nothing felt rushed. To many participants, this seemed like progress, a sign that impulsive behavior had finally been replaced by patience. The conflict emerged when patience began shaping outcomes instead of protecting against mistakes. When everyone waits, prices don't resolve quickly. They linger, and lingering creates space for doubt. Each unresolved move made the next decision heavier, not lighter. Liquidity reflected this shift immediately. Capital stayed available, but it refused to commit early. Depth appeared only after direction became clearer. Support no longer formed in anticipation stress. It arrived in response to it. The market had learned to react, not to lead. Institutional behavior reinforced the pattern. Committees met more often. Risk discussions grew longer. Decisions required broader agreement. Each layer of process reduced the chance of acting early. No one wanted to be wrong ahead of others. Waiting felt safer than ownership. The tension deepened as this mindset repeated. Small imbalances extended further than expected. Recoveries took longer. Momentum strategies lost reliability, not because direction was unclear, but because participation arrived late. Waiting had stretched the distance between pressure and response. Derivatives markets captured the discomfort clearly. Protection stayed bid even during quiet sessions. Skew refused to relax. Traders weren't hedging fear. They were hedging delay, the risk that no one would step in when needed. The buildup accelerated when correlations tightened. Assets that once balanced each other began moving together. Diversification weakened quietly. When waiting becomes universal, reactions synchronize, and synchronized hesitation amplifies movement. Veteran participants recognize the danger. Waiting works until it doesn't. In calm environments, delay feels harmless. In stress environments, delay becomes instability. Markets don't need panic to move sharply. They need absence of initiative. As sessions passed, the cost of waiting became harder to ignore. Each successful delay trained participants to wait longer next time. The system rewarded patience, until patience itself became the problem. Waiting had stopped being a defensive tactic. It had become the market's identity. And once identity forms around delay, the next challenge won't ask whether waiting is wise. It will ask whether waiting is even possible. Because when the moment arrives that demands action, a market trained to wait discovers too late that hesitation has already chosen the outcome. That moment arrived without warning, and it didn't feel dramatic at first. A moderate wave of uncertainty entered the market. Nothing historic, nothing extreme. In a different environment, it would have been absorbed smoothly. This time it stalled. Prices moved, then paused. Participants waited, exactly as they had been trained to do. Buyers hovered, watching for confirmation. Sellers pressed cautiously, testing how far patience would stretch. No one wanted to act early. No one wanted to own the first move. And in that shared delay, the market revealed its vulnerability. The conflict intensified as hesitation compounded. Each minute without response encouraged further pressure. What could have been contained quickly began spreading across assets. Not violently, but persistently. Waiting was no longer neutral. It was directional. Liquidity exposed the problem clearly. Depth appeared late. Support formed only after levels were breached. Capital responded to certainty instead of preventing uncertainty. The system had lost its ability to absorb stress proactively. Institutional systems reacted mechanically. Algorithms scaled back aggressiveness. Risk controls trimmed exposure. Committees convened again, but discussion couldn't replace timing. Every process designed to avoid mistakes now amplified delay. And delay, under pressure, became the mistake. The buildup accelerated as correlations tightened sharply. Assets that usually offset each other moved together. Diversification weakened. Strategies that relied on staggered participation found none. The market wasn't panicking. It was synchronized in hesitation. Veteran participants recognized the pattern immediately. Markets don't break when everyone is wrong. They break when everyone waits. Initiative disappears. Leadership dissolves, and price becomes the only mechanism left to force alignment. As pressure continued, familiar levels failed without a fight, not because sellers overwhelmed them, but because buyers never arrived with conviction. Waiting had hollowed out support long before the test appeared. That was the realization. The market hadn't been preparing for this moment. It had been postponing it. And now, waiting was no longer a strategy. It was a liability that had already shaped the outcome. The final phase would reveal what happens when a market trained to delay is finally forced to act, and how quickly waiting turns into movement once the choice is taken away. When action finally arrived, it didn't feel aggressive. It felt unavoidable. The market moved not because participants suddenly agreed, but because waiting was no longer an option. Prices adjusted with steady clarity, forcing alignment where hesitation had ruled. That was the climax. Not a surge of fear, but the collapse of delay. Once the first decisive move took hold, others followed quickly. Liquidity returned, but only after direction was established. Capital that had waited for certainty finally received it, just not at the levels it expected. The cost of patience was paid in distance, not panic. What became clear was unsettling. Waiting hadn't reduced risk. It had redistributed it. By delaying action, participants allowed small pressures to accumulate into larger adjustments. The market didn't punish boldness. It punished hesitation. As volatility settled, the resolution unfolded in behavior rather than headlines. Institutions rebuilt positions cautiously, but with clearer intent. Time horizons adjusted. Decision-making shortened. Waiting was no longer admired. It was questioned. The market stabilized, but it stabilized differently. Less forgiving, more sensitive to early moves, more aware that delay carries consequences. The system had learned a hard lesson about timing. The deeper takeaway lingered beneath every trade that followed. Waiting is useful when it's temporary. When it becomes structural, it erodes initiative. And initiative is what keeps markets resilient under uncertainty. Markets don't need constant action. They need readiness. Because the moment waiting becomes a strategy, the market begins deciding without you, and when it does, the price of delay is never negotiable. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. When